Floaters, Noyac, Long Island, summer 1972. The Marina. I was 9 years old when I saw my first dead bodies. A few years earlier, my parents had started bringing the 5 kids on month-long vacations in the Hamptons. Back then, so undeveloped that the ocean coastline at Bridgehampton was dominated by massive sand dunes without a house in sight. We always stayed in Noyac, a cluster of simple cottages rented by working-class folks. Located a 15-minute drive inland from Bridgehampton Beach, but within steps of an inlet called Mill Creek and the much larger Noyac Bay. Our first ever cottage in Noyac was a cute place called Stay a While. But with the arrival of my sister Catherine, we upgraded to a larger cottage called Bayview. It didn't really have much of a view. From its front porch, you could see slivers of water from between the houses across the street. But it was kitty corner from the Noyac Marina, which looked very pretty with the sun setting behind its boats and the open waters of Mill Creek. What it did have was a lot more precious space, including a loft-style second-story attic bedroom which looked down on the living room, where my brother Patrick and I slept. The Hamptons was a paradise for the beach-loving Connelly family. Short Beach, a 5-minute walk from the front steps of our cottage, was a narrow crescent of sand looking out on Noyac Bay. Most vacation mornings, we would pack a cart with beach gear, put Catherine in her stroller, and roll the short way along Pine Neck Avenue, which ended at a roundabout and the tiny Short Beach parking lot. We would position our beach blanket on a rise midway across the crescent of sand that divided the wide-open, often windy and choppy Noyac Bay in front of us from the always placid, boat-filled Mill Creek Inlet and its marina behind us. There are 2 iconic pictures of my father holding my hand on that rise of sand. In the first, I am so small I have to raise my arm to reach him. In the second, decades later in the exact same spot, still holding hands, I tower over him. A second great beach option, a 5-minute drive away, was the just as creatively named Long Beach, a mile long, also fronting Noyac Bay. And at least once a week, when we were in an adventurous mood, the family would pack up and head to the real thing at Bridgehampton Ocean Beach. I can only ever remember this water being incredibly rough and breathtakingly cold, with no shortage of jellyfish and rip currents that would suck your feet out from under you. It was bracing and exhilarating, and a perfect place to learn how to ride waves without killing yourself. One morning, we were particularly eager to get to Short Beach after tempestuous weather had kept us trapped in the cottage for 2 days. This involuntary hibernation had put on hold our nightly Best Rock contest, during which my father would pick winners across a dozen categories ranging from shiniest to smoothest to reddest to blackest to whitest to most looking like a particular person or whatever other ridiculous criterion my parents could come up with. The level of intensity surrounding this competition and the ferocity of the effort that went into preparing for it, hours searching the countless stones along the water's edge, bordered on the absurd, which explains why we could all be found that morning wandering around Short Beach, heads down like post-apocalyptic zombies, replenishing our depleted inventories. Gathered on the screened-in front porch to the sound of crickets chirping in the pitch-black night, we solemnly submitted our entries on the dining table, my father's back turned towards us to ensure impartiality. That did not prevent most nights from ending with Frank or Danny or Patrick or some combination of them storming away, offended that their entry had not been deemed to look most like Elvis Presley or Richard Nixon. My sister was too small to compete, And even at that young age, I knew from experience that engaging in a competition of any kind with my brothers was certifiably insane. Back home, games of Risk and Monopoly typically led to violence. Worst of all was chess. Frank would hunch over the board, studying it with the intensity of Garry Kasparov, but refusing to make a move, ignoring all attempts to monitor his time. Only my father refused to concede to frustration, leading to multi hour sessions in the kitchen. My father periodically rising from his place at the head of the table to pace back and forth, killing time while Frank furrowed his brows even tighter in search of the perfect move. I eventually lost interest in rock collecting and decided to swim at the Mill Creek Inlet behind our blanket and umbrella. 3-year-old Catherine was already splashing around the shallows, chasing the little crabs that skittered to their holes, just evading her grasp, while my mother kept a close eye nearby. I entered the water and proceeded around 40 feet, my toes sinking into the gooey sand. When I got as deep as my chest, the ground suddenly gave way beneath me, plunging my legs into much deeper, surprisingly cold water. I knew this was coming. They had dredged this bay to accommodate the multitudes of colorful, lightly bobbing boats which engulfed me as I swam further out. When I reached my distance limit, a couple of 100 feet from the shore, I was a good swimmer, but not as brave as my father, who would make it across the entire inlet, even in the pitch black dead of night. I stopped to rest and flipped face down onto my stomach. A dead man's float was easy to maintain in the buoyant salt water. I let myself relax as I lay suspended in the darkness. Jerry! Jerry! A muffled voice penetrated the liquid. I blew out air bubbles and raised my head. My mother was waving her arms from the shore. Jerry, you're out too far! I must have drifted. On the way back in, it occurred to me that I had forgotten my blow up float at Bayview. My dad had bought it for me as a special treat, stopping at a general store near the end of our 100-mile drive to the Hamptons from Brooklyn the previous week. He had blown it up on that first afternoon, a dizzying effort in the scorching heat. Fully distended, the float's tubular sections grew to almost 6 feet in length. Its coolest feature was a transparent plastic viewing hole at the end, which allowed me to lie on my stomach and look down into the water, a window on the world of crabs and stones and the occasional passing fish. Ma, can I go back to the cottage? I want to get my float and take it on the bay. Okay. Can you bring back the Cheez-Its I left on the table? If your father doesn't get a snack soon, he'll pass out. Still dripping, I put on my sandals, immediately painful as the sand scraped the gap between my big and second toes. Wearing nothing but my bathing suit, I left the beach and headed back down Pine Neck Avenue. To my right were the cottages, with occupants fortunate enough to have places with backyards looking out directly on the waters of Mill Creek. Most had docks and their own little boats. On the other side of the almost traffic-free tree-lined street were rows of more cottages, interrupted by cross streets, first Hampton Road, then Noyac Avenue, and finally Briar Lane. Bayview was in sight when I passed the Noyac Marina on my right. This was not a chi-chi marina like the one in Sag Harbor, where a multitude of yachts squeezed into their slips. There was no upscale restaurant overlooking the water. A harbor master building with peeling paint overlooked 2 weathered piers with oyster shell encrusted pylons and a couple of dozen boats, mostly gritty fishing vessels, and the kind of modest leisure crafts used by blue-collar types as floating bars. The marina was usually quiet during the week, but today there was activity that attracted my attention. A cluster of people gathered around a fishing boat moored at the nearest pier, in a spot closest to the shore. The people were far enough away and packed closely enough together that I couldn't see what they were looking at. I made the fateful decision to investigate. I turned right from the street, entered the marina, and approached the scene. How I wish that I had just continued down the street to Bayview, walked up its creaky steps, retrieved the Cheez-Its and float, and returned to the beach. None of the adults noticed me as I reached the group and peered through a gap. A bloated, decomposing body hung over the side of the boat, suspended by ropes just above the water. It might have been male, possibly African American. Its features were so deteriorated it was difficult to tell. Clad in tattered jeans and a white t-shirt, its skin was a mottled mess, a horrid rainbow of blacks, browns, reds, and yellows. There had been no attempt to cover the body. It was dangling there unceremoniously, its empty eye sockets staring blankly out on the world. The boat belonged to weekend fishermen, as I learned later. They had happened upon this corpse floating in the ocean, a victim of a boating accident precipitated by the violent storms across Long Island earlier that week. I imagined a pleasant day of beers and fishing turned into a nightmare by the sudden appearance of this horror. I wondered how long a corpse would float, buoyed by its internal gases. Did they find it face up? I could well understand why they did not choose to haul it up onto their deck. Pulling it closer and roping it to the side must have been bad enough. The adults spoke in hushed tones and stared. I rushed away and did not look back. A brief visit by Grandma Beatrice. I did not tell my family about the body when I returned to Short Beach. I had the irrational sense that I had done something wrong by investigating, that it was somehow my fault. Besides, I didn't want to interrupt the welcoming of Grandma Beatrice, who had arrived at the beach after her bus ride in from the city, moments before I returned to the parking lot. My father was happy to see both his mother and his Cheez-Its. My Grandma Beatrice, she of the traumatic orphan childhood and the vicious odd job assault, was making her first visit with us since we began the Hamptons vacation tradition. Whether due to space limitations at Bayview, our Uncle Tom would arrive the next day and occupy one of the cottage's rooms through the end of the month, or more likely an implicit understanding that she would be difficult to live with in such close quarters, Beatrice did not stay with us. She instead rented her own little bungalow 5 minutes away, one of many cookie-cutter standalone units in a complex that was a slight step up from a trailer park. Beatrice's plan to stay a week went violently awry the day after her arrival, when she was blown out the front door of her rental by a gas explosion, leaving her eyelashes and eyebrows singed to a crisp and the entire front half of her body and face caked in a black residue, leaving her looking like a wide-eyed, wizened Al Jolson. I know this because minutes after receiving a call from the property manager, my frantic father arrived on the scene with yours truly so soon after the event that Beatrice was still wandering around the bungalow's front yard in a daze. Though the full story will never be known, its main strands involve Beatrice attempting to smoke and cook while struggling in vain to get the balky gas stove and her cigarette lighter to function, evidently at the same time. The deafening explosion expelled her frail body backwards out the front door. After expressing great relief that she had miraculously escaped with no internal injuries, my father asked her why she had decided to cook, a reasonable question to a woman who had zero skills in that department, while Beatrice instinctively blamed my father. This whole episode could have been avoided had she stayed at our cottage, she told him, or had been able to afford a nicer place. I can't remember Grandma Beatrice ever returning to the Hamptons. Night fever. Soon after Beatrice departed, I came down with a fever. There was absolutely nothing worse than getting sick on vacation. With a temperature topping 100 degrees, I was bedridden, which meant being trapped in the cottage while everyone else enjoyed the beach. Over the coming days, the house was eerily quiet during those long intervals between my mother's regular check in visits. I longed for the moment when I'd hear the footsteps and voices of the whole crew finally streaming through the front door into the living room. That night, the shouts, yells, and laughs of the rock contest participants rose up to me from where they gathered on the front porch. After an eternity, everyone finally stomped across the creaky floor to their respective bedrooms, including Patrick, who mounted the stairs to our loft and slid into his bed, a single like mine, 6 feet across the room. My mother had already rinsed my body thoroughly with rubbing alcohol to alleviate my fever, a practice that I endured regularly back then, but which I now understand is potentially dangerous, as it can be absorbed through the skin or inhaled, causing alcohol poisoning, confusion, or even coma in children and adults. Our notorious family doctor, Irving Tansky, never mentioned these potential side effects. Patrick whispered over to me, still excited about the rock contest. He had tricked everyone by submitting the same rock that he had already won with in the looks most like a person category 2 nights ago. He made me promise not to tell. It helped his odds when Frank, upset at the prior night's results, staged a protest by submitting the same ordinary dull black rock for every category. Patrick grew quiet along with the house. I could hear his rhythmic breathing. I must have fallen asleep shortly thereafter. At some point during the night, I awoke wrapped in sweat-soaked sheets. Maybe my fever had broken, or maybe this meant it was worse. I was staring up at the yellowed tiles of the hung ceiling of the attic's peaked roof when the sound of heavy breathing turned my attention to the left, in the direction of my brother's bed. A shaft of moonlight shining through the small dormer window illuminated a patch of floor between our beds. Beyond that, Patrick was shrouded in darkness. The heavy breathing, guttural and clogged and unnaturally loud, seemed to echo off the walls. Had he caught my illness? I leaned up on my elbow and whispered, Pat, you okay? The breathing stopped short. I heard nothing for 30 long seconds until Patrick gasped, as if suffering from severe sleep apnea. I still couldn't see him. Pat, you okay? No response. I reached up and switched on the small table lamp on the nightstand in front of the window. It emitted a weak light. I squinted across what now felt like a vast chasm to my brother's bed. I could now see that Patrick lay face up, covered entirely by a white sheet. It was drawn so tightly that the contours of his face and body pressed through the fabric. Patrick, stop! You're not funny! Patrick emitted a wet, thick, shuddering cough which seemed to do nothing to dislodge whatever was in his lungs. I rose from my bed and stood on shaky legs. My head swooned from fear and fever. When I took a step across the chasm, I could now see that Patrick's face beneath the sheet glowed. Through the fabric pulsed an aura of greenish light. I rubbed my eyes to no avail. I looked back at my bed. It was empty. I was definitely not dreaming. I took a deep breath and another step closer until I was directly above his bed. Patrick's breathing became increasingly labored. It almost sounded like he was drowning. "Patrick, get up! I think you're sick." My whisper sounded like a scream in the tomb of our room. I saw the shape of my brother's arms move beneath the sheets. They rose in unison, up towards his head, until two hands appeared above the fabric and grasped the sheet's top edge. The mouth beneath the tight sheet's pulsing green fabric began to move. The voice was deep and gravelly and clogged and sounded nothing like my brother. "Jerry, I won the rock contest tonight. You know who mine looked like?" The figure began to giggle like a little girl until the titters devolved into a convulsive coughing fit. The sheet lowered farther down, inch by inch, by hands which I now noticed were black and mottled and bloated, and definitely not my brother's hands. Another inch, and I glimpsed a deeply striated forehead, viscous green fluid oozing from the crevasses, glimmered in the lamplight. The creature suddenly let out a high-pitched, gleeful screech. "It looked like me! Like my dead face! Let me show you!" I lurched backwards, jumped back into my bed, and cocooned myself in the blankets. I turned my back to the monster, curled into the fetal position, and squeezed my eyes shut under the covers. I willed myself to not move a muscle, not to make a sound, not to look, not to breathe. When I awoke, sunlight flooded the bedroom. There was no sign of life in the house. The entire day I was convinced it had not been a dream. Back home I'd had plenty of nightmares, no doubt fueled by my interest in all things scary. My bedroom dresser back home was topped with a sizable collection of horror-themed toy model sets I constructed. Each set, meticulously constructed by gluing together and painting dozens of pieces, featured a creepy character like the Mummy or the Wolfman, always with glow-in-the-dark faces. I had read Grimm's fairy tales and the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. But what happened with my brother felt different. I had been awake. I had stood over his bed. I had heard that voice. Even when Patrick finally came home after his long day at the beach, I still wasn't convinced. Hampton Days with Uncle Tom. As the vacation progressed, I, at long last, recovered from the fever, if not the nightmare. I continued to keep my back to Patrick as we slept. Indeed, for years thereafter back home in my own bedroom, I always slept with my face to the wall, my back to the threatening openness behind me. Despite my unsettled nights, the days began to take on the normal Hamptons routine, especially with the arrival of my Uncle Tom, who drove up to Bayview the same day Grandma Beatrice got blown out of her bungalow. He and my mother were very close. Their father, John Fleming, had died at age 50, leaving Tom with the responsibility for taking care of his little sister, one that he took seriously for the rest of his life. After his service in the Navy, Tom became a New York City policeman in 1957, 2 years after my father, eventually rising to the rank of captain. It is fair to say he didn't fit the typical stereotype of an old-school cop. Though coming from a family that had no exposure to the arts and no history of higher education, Tom attended the opera and often brought my mother to Manhattan's many art museums. He purchased a leather-bound collection of the great works of world literature. He read the New York Times and did its crossword religiously. He was unfailingly neat, fastidious, and well-dressed. What also stood out was his status as a lifetime bachelor, despite the good looks he shared with my mother. We never met a girlfriend or even heard of the existence of one. A picture of a dashing Tom in his navy whites as a young man leaves no doubt that he must have been highly eligible, especially since he was just a genuinely nice guy. He spoke softly, acted gently, and never had a bad thing to say about anyone. Tom could also be hilarious, even if that was not his intention. He was twitchy. His face went this way and that, his lip curling up, a trembling eyebrow. The hand in his pocket never stopped jingling spare coins. He might have been the least athletic man in the world. The kids had particular fun observing him at the beach. Upon arrival, he would expose his body to not a single ray of sun until every inch was slathered in copper tone. That he still managed to burn himself was certainly a function of his utter inertness once he plopped himself on his personal beach chair, budging only to pencil in another entry to his puzzle. I never saw him in the water. A particularly bad burn that turned the tops of his feet neon red left him wearing socks at the beach for the rest of the trip. His post-beach process was even more extensive. Not a grain of sand adhered to his body by the time he had finished. Waiting in the car, the kids would watch through the windows as he meticulously cleaned between each toe before finally carefully folding his monogrammed beach towel into a perfectly symmetric, tight square. We also kept a close eye on Tom at any social event. He always brought his own personal bottle of Seagram's. My father had stopped drinking by this time, and my mother preferred wine. He seemed to have zero tolerance for the stuff. One shot, and the tics and twitches disappeared, and he was transformed into a zombie. Wearing a pleasant little smile and a vacant-eyed stare, he sat there for the rest of the evening, not a word escaping his lips. My parents were always terrified when he insisted on driving himself home. Tom was generous with both his time and money, and our family was the sole beneficiary. He earned a good living, and other than his decision to buy a new car every year, spent little. His only vacations were with us at the Hamptons and years later at a timeshare in the Poconos. Without fail, he gave all the kids lavish gifts on every special occasion, which were endless when you consider not only the birthdays and Christmases, but communions, confirmations, and graduations for 5 Catholic children. And when he died of a heart attack in 1998 at the age of 66, he left all the money he had saved to my parents. His health had been declining after years of heavy smoking and a back injury, which forced his retirement from the police department and precipitated a huge weight gain. This inheritance gave my parents a financial cushion for the first time in their lives, allowing them to splurge on vacations, including transatlantic cruises and multiple trips to Aruba. Later in life, I learned more about how Tom supported the family. He taught my sister Catherine how to drive and prepared her successfully for what used to be the rigorous licensing test administered by New York City's DMV. Tom was twitchy and tick-ridden and likely often hungover, but he was still a dramatically better choice of driving instructor than either of my parents. My mother drove rarely, as she was terrified of both highways and parallel parking, a must-have skill for the driver's test. And my father, who had taught me to drive, was a seething ball of anxiety who would death grip the dashboard at the gentlest tap of the brakes. I survived one lesson with him before enrolling in my high school's driver's education course. Most important, Uncle Tom was there for my parents at their very lowest moments. It was Tom who accompanied my father to the psychiatric hospital when he had his breakdown, and Tom who picked him up several weeks and multiple shock treatments later. And when my father was so addled that he couldn't recognize even his closest colleagues, Tom took him to the police station so he could pick up his paycheck. Tom was a rock when my parents' world was spinning out of control. Tom was also generous with his time in the summer of 1972, when every morning in the Hamptons, he let me accompany him to breakfast at the Paradise Restaurant. located on Main Street in Sag Harbor, just past the cinema and hardware stores. He arose early, well before any of my siblings, so I made sure I was up and ready and waiting on the front steps just as he opened the door to leave. My parents didn't have the money to take us out to eat, so this was truly a special occasion. Tom gave me a silent nod as he descended the steps. Then we got into his car, which was, as usual, at most a year old. What an exciting contrast to the ancient Chevrolet our family always prayed would survive the 100-mile drive from Brooklyn to Sag Harbor. But Tom's cars never had that new car smell. Getting in, he immediately lit a cigarette, permeating the interior with smoke. Incredibly, Tom smoked even more than my father. A cigarette never left his mouth other than to take bites of food. I had heard from my mother that he even woke up multiple times a night to smoke in bed. Minutes later, we quickly found a spot on Main Street. The Paradise restaurant was bustling, even at this early hour. We sat at a booth, and I gave the waitress my regular order: a steaming platter of hash browns, bacon, pancakes overflowing with melted butter, all topped with 3 sunny-side-up eggs. This was beyond delicious for a kid who otherwise ate Cheerios or cornflakes for breakfast. Aunt Jemima's pancakes, drowning in her syrup, were reserved for special occasions. The only dish I had ever experienced which topped the Paradise's breakfast platter was my next-door neighbor, Miss Dunai's renowned potato pancakes. Tom and I said very little to each other while I ate, and Tom took drags on his cigarette between bites. He was not a big talker, which gave me the opportunity to take in the microcosm of Sag Harbor society, represented by the Paradise's clientele. I scanned the booths for the celebrities my mother said spent summers in Sag Harbor. Perhaps a pale, dissipated old man, Truman Capote, who'd written In Cold Blood and was known for eating his hangover breakfasts at the diner. We paid up. Tom always left a generous tip. And I arrived home feeling sated and special. This tradition, which I believe was unique to me, did nothing to assuage my older brother's contention that I was terribly spoiled. After we got home, Tom went with us to Bridgehampton Beach. As usual, the beach was almost empty, its towering sand dunes and lines of whitecaps extending miles east and west. We left Tom to complete his oiling routine and raced directly into the roiling water, where we body surfed the massive waves for hours. Only starvation finally forced us out. Huddled together under the umbrella, we inhaled bologna sandwiches on Wonder Bread, grains of sand somehow finding their way into every gritty bite. Waterlogged, windblown, and sunburned, we waited for Uncle Tom to denude himself of any trace of sand, then returned to the empty parking lot and headed off for home. On the way, we made our regular stop at the farmer's stand, a ramshackle shack on the edge of an endless field of swaying corn, with its fold-out tables groaning under the weight of baskets overflowing with fruits and vegetables. Where huge mansions now loom, the road from Bridgehampton to Sag Harbor used to feature endless stretches of farmland. We filled paper bags with locally grown corn, tomatoes, and potatoes, central ingredients in our nightly barbecues in Bayview's cloistered backyard. Back home, my father poked at the mass of potatoes with a fork, wrapped them in aluminum foil, and let them cook for an hour directly on the coals. If he got the timing just right, the potato emerged from its silver cocoon perfectly crispy on the outside, almost creamy on the inside, and primed to be split open, smothered in generous dollops of butter and seasoned with salt and pepper. The corn husks, arrayed neatly side by side, were placed on the grate to cook. Later, we scalded our hands unsheathing the steaming stalks, rolled the corn on a hunk of butter till it was dripping, then took an end in each hand and rotated the stalks in our mouths, attacking those delectably sweet niblets like ravenous beavers. As the evening wore on, the used husks grew into a pile at the center of the picnic table, high enough to block my view of my brothers across from me. The deep red, juicy tomatoes topped the thick cheeseburgers, which were placed on toasted Kaiser rolls. Juice rolled down my chin as I struggled to open my mouth wide enough to take another bite. To this day, I have never recaptured the intense flavor of those farm fresh ingredients or the utter perfection of those burgers. The last day. Dread and foreboding spread over all of us at the end of the month. It made us almost physically ill to contemplate returning back home to 2054 83rd Street. We spent our last day on Short Beach. The normal routines took on a solemnity commensurate with the knowledge that this would be our final time doing each of these things until a lifetime from now, until the summer of 1973. It was late in the day, much later than we normally stayed at Short Beach. No one wanted to leave. We would have to pack the car and depart first thing the next morning. My mother was asleep on the blanket under the umbrella next to an equally inert Catherine. My father was swimming across Mill Creek. I could see that he had almost reached its far end almost a mile away. My brothers had disappeared, perhaps to the bird sanctuary adjacent to the beach, where they often ventured to mess with the nests, relocate an egg or two, setting off furious attacks by the returning mothers, who'd swoop down and go for the eyes. In a contemplative mood, I decided to take my float out for one last ride on Noyac Bay. The breeze had created some ripples, but this far inland, the bay rarely experienced real waves. The float flapped in the wind behind me as I dragged it down the sandy slope towards the water with the rope that was tied to its back end. In bare feet, I stepped delicately over the rocks and sharp shells at the water's edge and lay the float down once the water reached my midsection. I mounted the float, straddled it like a horse, and began paddling. After a few minutes, I turned my head and was surprised to see that our umbrella and blanket at the top of the rise of sand already looked much smaller on the horizon. The wind at my back was boosting my progress. When I had gone out far enough, I stopped paddling, lay down on my stomach, rested my forehead on top of my crossed arms, and peered out down through the clear plastic window of the float's viewing hole. I searched in vain for a crab or fish or colorful shells. This far from shore, it was too deep to see anything but darkness. Between the rhythmic chop rocking the float and the blackness of the hole in front of my eyes, I felt myself relax. It had been a long, hot day in the sun. My eyes drooped. Lying there motionless, I must have looked like a shipwreck survivor, sapped of all energy, clinging to his plank. Time passed, and the fiery ball of the sun continued its descent. The burgeoning breeze, now stiffer and cooler, skimmed the bay and coaxed the water into ripples that took me out farther and deeper than I had ever been. On the float, still inert, I was dreaming it was winter. In my mind, I held a sled tightly at the top of a steeply sloping hill, then hesitated an instant before plunging down in a blur. As I hurtled forward, cold, wet specks of snow stung my face and the wind blew back my hair. The path was smooth until I approached bottom, where the sleds of many predecessors had worn the snow to dirt in places. I tensed at the approaching rough spots, tried to adjust course, but my speed was too great. My sled lurched as it crossed the first gravelly section. I heard the dirt sliding beneath me before the sled flipped and my body catapulted through the air. I was about to land face first in a particularly rocky patch. At the moment of contact, I jolted up from the float. I rubbed my face as if in search of injury. Still on my stomach, I pushed up with my arms and rotated my head to scan the surroundings. In the distance behind me, I discerned a minute yellow dot on the shore that might be our umbrella. Straight ahead was the tree lined skyline of a faraway shore on the other side of Noyak Bay. I didn't even know what that land was. Shelter Island? I tried to recall my dream, but the details were already slipping away. I only remembered being cold, like I was beginning to feel now, with the water lapping over the float and the waning sun offering little warmth. It was time to get back. It was disconcerting to be so far from shore, and no doubt my parents would be wondering where the hell I had disappeared to. I sat up and straddled the float. I began to shiver as the steady breeze struck my wet chest and stomach. With my legs dangling in the water, I paddled with one hand to turn the float in the direction of the beach. But the float was sluggish. Despite my vigorous flapping, it barely turned. I grimaced in confusion and stopped paddling. Moments later, a swell brushed something solid against my leg. Startled, I kicked at the unseen object, then searched the black water in vain. It must have been a stray piece of wood. Perhaps colliding with it had been what woke me up. I decided that I could propel the float with more strength lying on my stomach. With legs extended and face pressed against the transparent viewing window, I plunged my arms into the water and paddled vigorously. But I made minimal progress despite the rapid strokes. I was beginning to tire when my right hand struck a submerged, mushy surface. As I recalled up to a sitting position, my eyes were drawn down to the float's viewing hole. A wide-eyed, open-mouthed woman stared up at me. A halo of flowing blonde hair partially obscured a pitted, bloated face that looked shocked at its predicament. Her swollen limbs extended out from the float's perimeter. Impeccably manicured long nails, polished bright pink, hung on precariously to grotesquely swollen fingers. I jumped off the float and swam frantically. 10 yards away, gasping, I stopped and screamed, "Hey! Help! Help!" I looked with wild eyes beyond the choppy waters to the impossibly tiny umbrella on the beach. With the wind blowing in my face, there was no way my parents could hear me, and I'd never make it if I tried to swim such a distance. But there was a dead, naked lady under the float, and she had grabbed my leg. She would certainly pull me down with her if I went back. My arms felt like dead weights. I tried to rest by doing a dead man's float, but I choked and sputtered as the salty water kept on filling my mouth. Marshaling my strength and my nerve, I doggy paddled back in the direction of the float. A couple of feet away, I stopped, caught my breath, and collected my thoughts. All I needed to do was to pull the float off the body. No problem. I would just slide it off, hop on, and get my ass back to the beach. I raised my right arm and reached for the float. I would have lost it entirely if a decaying dead leg, or even worse, a hand, touched me. Keeping my body as far away as possible, I gained a secure grip on the float's back edge. I was going to yank hard and leave the dead thing behind. My first tug met resistance. I could feel the body's loose flesh scraping against the float's rough canvas underside. I knew that the dangling limbs must now be just inches away. Overcoming my temptation to flee, I yanked at the float with all my strength. This time, thank God, it slid free. I was crying with relief as I maneuvered the float several feet away and clambered back on. My body heaved with the exertion. Straddling the float and paddling with both hands, I was now easily able to spin it in the direction of the shadow-shrouded shore. I refused to look behind me. I could not bear seeing that thing, fully exposed, staring blankly up to the sky, its soggy breasts floating in the swell like ghastly buoys. I had progressed several feet when the float came to a sudden standstill. A piteous whine escaped my lips. I swung my arms into the water like windmills until I was sucking in air, but the float would not budge. Something was definitely holding me back. Help me! Oh God! Steeling myself, I slowly turned to look behind me. I gasped at the sight. My worst fears were confirmed. The dead body was pursuing me. Its deteriorating face was less than 5 feet from the back end of the float. With each ripple, the gap shrank. I twisted away and squeezed my teary eyes shut. I moaned, told myself this can't be happening. She's dead. She can't swim. Shivers racked my thin frame. I could feel those cold, dead hands clawing at my back with their razor-sharp pink fingernails, reaching up to wrap around my neck. But the dreaded touch did not come. I felt nothing but the wind. So with great effort, I again gathered up my courage, opened my eyes, and slowly turned my head. The corpse was close enough to touch, so close that I could distinguish amongst its blonde locks a thicker white strand. Leaning closer, I saw that it was the rope attached to the back end of the float. It had somehow become entangled in the creature's hair. I picked up the wet rope and gave it an exploratory tug. The dead thing's head jerked, and a shudder convulsed its form. The body eased even closer, within a foot of the float. I was paralyzed, my eyes fixed upon this horror, when the tip of its finger grazed my right knee. A swift, involuntary kick sunk my large toe so deeply into the soft flesh of the corpse's back that I felt bone. I squealed and yanked the rope desperately. It ripped free with a sucking, tearing sound, and its weighted end swung in the air before landing with a squishy plop. Reddish yellow fluid snaked down my chest and accumulated in the folds of my stomach. Clotted hair attached to a doughy piece of scalp draped like a grisly scarf across my left shoulder. I flung off the hairy flesh spasmodically. Screaming, crying, I plunged my hands in the water and paddled for my life. Screamed, paddled, until I heard my mother's shrill voice calling out to me through the wind. And looking up, I saw in the waning light the silhouette of my mother and father, huddled together at the water's edge, a tableau of concern. With my last bit of strength, I surged forward. We left the Hamptons early the next morning, my parents none the wiser. Even as an adult, I have never entered those waters again.